She purchased a broken clock tower for 45 cents at a county auction, where wealthy developers and antique collectors with deep pockets sat motionless, watching her bid on what should have been a historic gold mine. But not a single person raised their paddle to challenge her offer. Seraphina Blackwood looked around the packed courthouse steps in the small town of Thornwick Falls, Vermont, expecting anyone to outbid her for the 150-year-old Victorian clock tower that dominated the town square. The structure needed restoration work, certainly, but for less than 50 cents. Even in its current state of disrepair, the tower's prime location and historic architecture should have attracted fierce competition from developers looking to convert it into luxury condos or boutique shops. The silence stretched longer than it should have. "Going once," the auctioneer called, his voice oddly flat, despite the crowd of over 60 people gathered for the municipal property sale. Seraphina noticed his hands were trembling slightly as he held the gavel, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead, despite the crisp October morning. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Seraphina had attended dozens of property auctions over her 15-year career as a real estate developer, and she'd never seen anything quite like this. The crowd was substantial. Local business owners, antique dealers, property investors, and what appeared to be several out-of-town developers with expensive suits and briefcases full of cash. These were serious buyers with serious money, the kind of people who would normally engage in bidding wars over far less valuable properties. Yet every single one of them sat frozen in their folding chairs, staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite decipher. Not anger or frustration at being outbid, not envy at her lucky break, but something that made her skin crawl. Pity, pure, undisguised pity, as if she'd just volunteered to drink poison instead of making what should have been the investment opportunity of a lifetime. The locals were the worst. She could see it in their faces, a mixture of sorrow and resignation, as if they were watching a tragedy unfold and were powerless to prevent it. Some of them had their hands pressed to their mouths, others were shaking their heads slowly from side to side. A few looked like they wanted to stand up and shout warnings, but were being held back by some invisible force. Near the front row, Seraphina spotted Evangeline Thorne, the elderly woman who ran the town's antique shop. Evangeline was known throughout New England for her ability to spot valuable pieces at estate sales and auctions. She had a reputation for aggressive bidding and had once driven the price of a Civil War-era armoire up to $15,000 just to keep it from leaving town. Yet here she sat, her bidding paddle clutched in white-knuckled fingers, making no move to participate in what should have been the auction of her dreams. The warning as the auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in the crisp October air. Evangeline Thorne rose from her chair with obvious effort. Her weathered hands clutched a worn tapestry purse, and she approached Seraphina's seat with urgency written across her deeply lined face. "Child," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the restless crowd, "you don't want that place. Trust an old woman who's lived in this town for 73 years. Some things are better left untouched." Evangeline's eyes darted nervously toward the clock tower's main timepiece, its hands frozen at 11:47, for as long as anyone in Thornwick Falls could remember. The old woman's hands were shaking, and Seraphina could see genuine fear in her pale blue eyes. "What do you mean?" Seraphina asked quietly. But before Evangeline could elaborate, the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel cut through the morning air like a gunshot. Sold to the young lady in the emerald coat for 45 cents. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, reverberating off the Victorian buildings that surrounded the town square. For a moment, absolute silence fell over the crowd. Then, as if some spell had been broken, people began to rise from their chairs and gather their belongings with unusual haste. But instead of the typical post-auction chatter about good deals and missed opportunities, Seraphina heard only hushed whispers and fragments of worried conversations. Should have tried harder to stop her. Poor thing has no idea what she's gotten herself into. Nobody's been inside since the Hartwell incident. What happened to old Cornelius was no accident, mark my words. The name Cornelius's sent a chill down Seraphina's spine, though she couldn't say why. She made a mental note to research the town's history once she had a chance to visit the local library, completing the purchase. The town clerk, a nervous man named Tobias Grimsby, approached her with the deed and transfer papers. His hands shook so violently that he could barely hold the documents steady, and when Seraphina tried to make eye contact, he immediately looked away. "Congratulations on your purchase, Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything appears to be in order." Seraphina studied the paperwork carefully. The clock tower, officially known as the Meridian Time Tower, had been built in 1873 by a master clockmaker named Cornelius Hartwell. The building sat on a quarter-acre lot in the heart of Thornwick Falls historic district, and included not just the tower itself, but also a small adjacent building that had once served as Hartwell's workshop and residence. "Mr. Grimsby," she said, looking up from the documents, "can you tell me anything about the building's history? Why has it been empty for so long, and why didn't anyone else bid on it?" Tobias Grimsby's face went pale, and he began gathering his papers with frantic haste. "I'm sorry, Miss Blackwood, but I have other auctions to conduct today. If you have questions about the property's history, you might want to speak with someone at the Thornwick Falls Historical Society." Before she could ask another question, he hurried away, leaving her standing alone with the deed to a Victorian clock tower that apparently nobody in town wanted to own or even discuss. The watchers as Seraphina signed the final transfer documents on the hood of her car, she became aware of an unsettling phenomenon. Every single person who had attended the auction was still present in the town square, but none of them were making any move to leave. Instead, they had positioned themselves at various points around the cobblestone plaza, all of them watching her with the patient intensity of predators, waiting for prey to make a fatal mistake. Some pretended to browse the windows of the shops that lined the square. Others sat on park benches, feeding pigeons or reading newspapers they weren't actually looking at. A few stood in small clusters, engaging in conversations that seemed forced and artificial, but all of them, without exception, were keeping her under surveillance. The weight of their collective gaze made Seraphina's skin crawl. She'd been in hostile business negotiations before, faced down angry property owners and corrupt city officials, but she'd never experienced anything quite like this. It felt less like human curiosity and more like the way wildlife might watch a predator that had wandered into their territory, wary, fearful, but unable to look away. As she walked across the cobblestones toward her new property, their eyes followed her every step. She could feel their attention like a physical presence, pressing against her back and making the short journey feel like the longest walk of her life. First approach to the tower. The Meridian Time Tower stood at the southeastern corner of Thornwick Falls Town Square, its red brick facade weathered but structurally impressive. The building rose 4 stories into the Vermont sky, its Gothic Revival architecture a testament to the craftsmanship of a bygone era. Intricate stone carvings adorned the corners and window frames, depicting intertwining vines, celestial symbols, and what appeared to be clockwork mechanisms, rendered in remarkable detail. The tower's most striking feature was, of course, the massive clock face that dominated the 3rd story. The timepiece was easily 12 feet in diameter, with ornate bronze hands and Roman numerals that had been crafted with extraordinary precision. But those hands had been frozen at 1147 for decades, according to the locals Seraphina had spoken with during her pre-auction research. Stained glass windows caught the October sunlight like jewels, casting rainbow patterns across the tower's brick walls. The main entrance was secured with a heavy oak door that looked original to the 1870s construction, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. Adjacent to the main tower stood a smaller 2-story building that had clearly been designed as a companion structure. This was where Cornelius Hartwell had lived and worked, according to the property records. The building's windows were boarded up, and ivy had claimed much of its eastern wall, giving it an abandoned appearance that contrasted sharply with the tower's strangely pristine condition. The unlocked door Seraphina approached the tower's main entrance with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She'd expected to need a locksmith to gain entry to a building that had supposedly been vacant for decades, but when she tried the ornate brass handle, it turned smoothly in her hand. Too smoothly. The mechanism operated with the fluid precision of hardware that had been recently cleaned and oiled. There was no resistance, no grinding of neglected metal against metal, no protest from hinges that should have been frozen with rust and age. Someone had been maintaining this lock, keeping it in perfect working order, despite the building's apparently abandoned state. The heavy oak door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a circular interior that took Seraphina's breath away. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in brilliant blues, reds, and golds. The air inside was cool and dry, with only the faintest trace of mustiness, nothing like the oppressive stained nothing. The ground floor workshop. The tower's ground floor was a single circular room, but had been sealed for years. The walls were lined with built-in cabinets, workbenches, and tool storage, and spoonful that spoke of the original owner's dedications, and tool storage that spoke of the original owner's dedication to his craft. Everything was made from rich, dark wood that had been lovingly maintained and polished to a warmth that had been lovingly maintained and polished to a warm cut that had been lovingly maintained and polished to a warm glow. Seraphina moved deeper into the space, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. The workbenches were still equipped with an impressive array of clock-making tools, precision hammers, tiny screwdrivers, jeweler's loops, and instruments she couldn't identify. They hung from hooks and lay in organized rows across felt-lined drawers, arranged with the obsessive precision of someone who had cared deeply about their work. But it was the condition of these tools that puzzled her. Despite being decades old, they showed no signs of rust or neglect. The metal surfaces gleamed as if they'd been recently polished, and when she picked up a small brass hammer, it felt perfectly balanced in her hand, its wooden handle smooth from years of use, but showing no signs of deterioration. On one of the workbenches, she found a half-completed clock mechanism. The gears and springs were arranged in precise order, as if the clockmaker had simply stepped away for a moment and intended to return shortly. A magnifying glass was positioned over a tiny component, and a set of micro-tools lay ready for delicate adjustments. Most unsettling of all, There was a cup of tea sitting beside the work area. The liquid had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark stain at the bottom of the porcelain cup, but the placement suggested that someone had been working here recently, very recently. Seraphina climbed the spiral staircase, her hand trailing along the smooth wooden banister as she ascended to the tower's second level. What she found there made her stop in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The entire floor was filled with clocks, not just a few antique timepieces, but hundreds of them. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels around the circular room's perimeter, their wooden cases ranging from simple pine to elaborate mahogany with mother-of-pearl inlays. Mantel clocks occupied every available surface: Greek Revival marble pieces, ornate French bronze works, and delicate porcelain examples that looked like they belonged in a museum. Wall-mounted clocks covered every inch of available space between the windows. Cuckoo clocks from the Black Forest, regulator clocks with pendulums visible behind glass doors, and astronomical clocks that tracked the phases of the moon and the movement of the planets. Some were as large as dinner plates, others no bigger than her palm. Display cases held pocket watches by the dozens, gold hunting cases, silver railroad watches, delicate ladies' timepieces encrusted with precious stones. Each one was positioned with care, as if this were a high-end jewelry store, rather than the interior of an abandoned clock tower. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the quantity or quality of the collection. It was the fact that every single timepiece showed exactly the same time, 11:47. The impossible synchronization. Seraphina moved through the collection in a state of growing amazement and unease. She'd initially assumed that the clocks had simply stopped at random times over the years, but closer inspection revealed an impossible truth. Every clock, regardless of size, style, or apparent age, displayed precisely the same moment, 11 hours and 47 minutes. Not approximately 11:47, not close to that time. The minute hands were positioned at exactly the same angle, the hour hands at precisely the same spot between 11 and 12. Even the second hands on timepieces that possessed them were frozen at identical positions. She pulled out her smartphone to check the current time, 2:18 p.m. She'd been inside the tower for nearly an hour, exploring and examining the ground floor workshop. Yet according to every timepiece in this extraordinary collection, time itself had stopped at 11:47 on some unknown day in the past. Seraphina was a practical woman with an engineering background. She understood mechanics, cause and effect, the way the physical world operated according to predictable laws. But what she was seeing challenged everything she thought she knew about how clocks worked. There was simply no mechanical explanation for how hundreds of different timepieces, created by different makers in different eras, using different technologies, could all fail at precisely the same moment. Unless they hadn't failed at all. The third floor observatory. The third floor revealed an even more elaborate collection, focused primarily on astronomical and scientific timepieces. Here were chronometers that had once guided ships across oceans, observatory clocks calibrated to track the movement of stars, and complex mechanical calculators that could predict eclipses and planetary alignments. Large windows provided panoramic views of Thornwick Falls and the surrounding Vermont countryside. Through the eastern window, Seraphina could see the White Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. To the west, the Green Mountains rolled away toward New York State, their slopes blazing with autumn colors that seemed almost impossibly vivid in the afternoon light. But it was the view directly below that caught her attention. From this height, She could see the entire town square, and she realized that the watchers from the auction hadn't dispersed. They were still there, positioned at strategic points around the plaza, all of them maintaining their vigil with the patience of professional surveillance operatives. Some had taken seats at the outdoor cafe across the square, nursing cups of coffee that had long since grown cold. Others browsed the windows of shops with obvious disinterest, their attention clearly focused on the clock tower rather than the merchandise on display. A few sat on park benches, pretending to read books or newspapers while keeping the building under constant observation. Seraphina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. These people weren't just curious about her purchase, they were monitoring the situation with the intensity of guards at a high-security facility. The question was, what did they think they were guarding against? The heart of the tower. The fourth floor housed the tower's main clock mechanism, and here Seraphina made her most disturbing discovery yet. The massive clockwork that should have been driving the external timepiece was not only intact, but appeared to be in perfect working condition. The brass gears gleamed like gold, the steel springs showed no signs of rust or fatigue, and the enormous pendulum hung motionless but ready. More unsettling still, she could hear a faint but distinct ticking sound echoing through the mechanism chamber. Not the steady, rhythmic ticking of a normally functioning clock, but something irregular and somehow wrong, like a heartbeat with an arrhythmia, or footsteps on a staircase that had one step missing. The main drive mechanism was an extraordinary piece of 19th-century engineering. Weights the size of bowling balls hung from braided steel cables, suspended in a shaft that descended through all 4 floors of the tower. The escapement mechanism was a work of art, its polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the clockroom's windows. But despite the obvious care that had been taken to maintain the mechanism, the external clock hands remained frozen at 11:47. Somehow the clockwork was operating. She could hear it, could see the subtle vibrations in the pendulum shaft, but its motion wasn't translating to the clock face that the entire town could see. The clockmaker's journal on a workbench beside the main mechanism, Seraphina found a leather-bound journal that appeared to be both ancient and impossibly well preserved. The cover was soft brown leather that showed no signs of cracking or age, and the brass clasp opened smoothly at her touch. Inside, she discovered page after page of handwritten notes in precise, old-fashioned script. The entries were dated, but the dates defied logical explanation. Some entries were from the 1920s, others from the 1960s, and several appeared to be from just the past few years. All were written in the same careful hand, as if a single person had been maintaining this journal for over a century. The most recent entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, read October 10th. The convergence approaches once again. The barriers between moments grow thin as we near the anniversary. The town feels it. I can see it in their faces when they pass beneath the tower. They remember even if they don't understand what they remember. 47 minutes past 11 is when the membrane is thinnest, when past and present touch like lovers' fingertips across an impossible distance. Someone must maintain the vigil until the next keeper arrives. The responsibility cannot be abandoned, no matter the cost. The town depends on it. Time itself depends on it. Earlier entries were even more cryptic. March 15, 1987, the mechanism grows stronger with each passing year. What Cornelius began in 1873 has taken on a life of its own. The clocks throughout the tower now synchronize without my intervention, as if they're drawing power from some source beyond our understanding. I begin to suspect that we're not controlling time so much as time is controlling us. June 3, 1954. A visitor came today, a physicist from the university, who'd heard rumors about our temporal anomaly. I showed him nothing, told him the clocks were simply broken. But he lingered in the square for hours, taking measurements with strange instruments. When he left, he looked afraid. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. November 28th, 1923. 50 years since the Great Stopping, and still the town pretends not to know what really happened that day. But I see the truth in their eyes when they look at the tower. They remember the screaming, even if they can't remember whose screams they were. They remember the light that poured from the clock face like liquid starlight. Most of all, they remember the silence that followed, the terrible, absolute silence when every clock in Thornwick Falls stopped at exactly the same moment. The watcher's identity as Seraphina studied the journal. A shadow passed across the stained glass window behind her. She looked up to see a figure standing motionless in the town square below, staring directly up at the clock tower's 4th floor. Even from this height, she could tell the person was positioned to have a clear view of the mechanism room. The watcher was an elderly man in a long dark coat, distinguished-looking with silver hair and a carefully trimmed beard. He stood with the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority, but there was something in his stillness that seemed unnatural. He didn't shift his weight, didn't adjust his position, didn't move at all, except for the slow, deliberate turn of his head as he tracked her movement from window to window. When their eyes met through the colored glass, Seraphina felt a jolt of recognition that she couldn't explain. She'd never seen this man before, she was certain of that, but something about his face triggered a deep, primal fear that made her step back from the window. The man reached into his coat and withdrew something that caught the afternoon sunlight, a pocket watch on a long chain. He held it up so she could see it clearly, then made a gesture that chilled her to the bone. He pointed at the watch, then at the frozen clock face on the tower, then directly at her. The message was unmistakable. He knew about the time discrepancy. He'd been watching the tower for exactly this purpose, and now that someone had gained access to the mechanism room, his vigil was entering a new phase. As Seraphina watched, the man turned and walked away with measured, precise steps, not the casual gait of someone heading home, but the deliberate pace of someone who had preparations to make. She noticed that his movements were perfectly timed, as if he were marching to the beat of an inaudible metronome. Evening shadows were beginning to stretch across Thornwick Falls as Seraphina descended the tower's spiral staircase, her mind reeling from everything she'd discovered. The journal entries, the synchronized clocks, the mysterious watcher, all of it pointed to something far more complex and potentially dangerous than a simple real estate investment. Any rational person would have left the tower, driven back to Boston, and tried to sell the property as quickly as possible. The building was clearly at the center of some long-standing local mystery that the townspeople were desperate to keep hidden. Whatever secrets lay within these walls had already cost at least one person their life, if the journal entries were to be believed. But Seraphina had never been particularly rational when it came to mysteries. Her engineering background had taught her to look for logical explanations, to dig deeper when systems didn't operate according to expected parameters. And everything about the Meridian Time Tower suggested a system that was operating according to rules she didn't yet understand. More importantly, the journal's most recent entry had mentioned something about a keeper and the approach of an anniversary. If the previous caretaker had indeed been maintaining this place for decades, his absence might explain why the town was so fearful. Perhaps they weren't watching her with malicious intent. Perhaps they were hoping she would prove capable of fulfilling whatever role her predecessor had abandoned. As darkness fell over Thornwick Falls, Seraphina made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. Instead of leaving to find a hotel for the night, she would remain in the clock tower and see what happened when the town's clock struck 11:47. She had no way of knowing that this choice would put her at the center of a mystery that had been carefully guarded for over a century, a secret so profound that it would challenge everything she thought she knew about the nature of time, memory, and the thin boundaries between past and present. The watchers in the town square began to thin out as businesses closed and families headed home for dinner. But Seraphina noticed that several figures remained at their posts, settling in for what appeared to be a long night of surveillance. Whatever they expected to happen at 11:47, they intended to be there to witness it. As she prepared to spend her first night in the Meridian Time Tower, Seraphina couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover why nobody else had been willing to bid on a building that should have been worth millions. The answer, she suspected, would prove to be worth far more than money and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As darkness settled over Thornwick Falls, Seraphina positioned herself in the tower's mechanism room with the clockmaker's journal open beside her. Through the windows, she could see the remaining watchers taking up positions around the town square, their cigarette tips glowing like fireflies in the October night. At 11:46 p.m., something extraordinary began to happen. Every clock in the tower started ticking in perfect unison, hundreds of timepieces that had been silent for decades suddenly coming to life with a sound like mechanical thunder. The building vibrated with their synchronized rhythm, and Seraphina felt the vibrations in her bones. Then, at exactly 11:47, everything stopped, but not just the clocks. Everything. The temporal anomaly. The silence was absolute and terrifying. No wind, no distant traffic, no settling of old wood. Even her own heartbeat seemed suspended. Through the windows, Seraphina could see the watchers frozen mid-motion like statues, cigarette smoke hanging motionless in the air like grey ribbons. Then she heard footsteps on the spiral staircase, slow, measured steps climbing toward the mechanism room. But that was impossible. She'd locked the tower door from the inside. As the footsteps grew closer, Seraphina noticed something that made her blood run cold. The steps were perfectly timed to match the rhythm of a ticking clock, as if whoever was climbing was keeping time to some invisible metronome. The footsteps stopped just outside the mechanism room door. "You've done well to make it this far," said a voice she recognized from the journal entries, cultured, precise, speaking with the careful diction of another era. But now comes the real test, the clockmaker's return. The door opened to reveal an elderly man in Victorian dress, high collar, gold pocket watch chain, hands stained with the permanent ink marks of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with delicate mechanisms. His face was exactly as she'd imagined from reading his journal entries, but there was something translucent about his appearance, as if he were made of moonlight and memory. "Cornelius Hartwell," he said, though she'd already guessed his identity. "And you, Miss Blackwood, are my replacement." Seraphina found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "You're dead. The journal entries said you disappeared in 1873. Dead?" Cornelius smiled sadly. "In the conventional sense, perhaps. But time works differently here. At this moment between moments, I've been waiting 150 years for someone worthy to take over my duties." He gestured toward the main clock mechanism, which was now glowing with an inner light that had nothing to do with electricity. "Do you understand what you've inherited, Miss Blackwood? This isn't just a clock tower. It's a temporal anchor. Every town, every city needs one, a fixed point that keeps time flowing in the proper direction." The truth revealed, Cornelius explained that he'd discovered the temporal anomaly by accident in 1873 while calibrating the tower's main clock. At precisely 11:47 on October 31st, he'd found himself existing in a moment between seconds, able to observe time from outside its normal flow. "The universe has cracks," he said, his hands moving over the mechanism with practiced familiarity. "Moments where past and future touch, where the linear progression of time becomes unstable. Most people live their entire lives without noticing these moments, but clockmakers were sensitive to temporal irregularities." He showed her how the mechanism worked, not through gears and springs, but through manipulation of time itself. The hundreds of synchronized clocks weren't just keeping time, they were time, creating a stable temporal field that prevented the anomaly from spreading beyond Thornwick Falls. Without constant maintenance, the field would collapse. Cornelius continued. Time would begin flowing backward in this area, creating paradoxes that could unravel causality for hundreds of miles in every direction. The Watcher's purpose: the people in the town square weren't enemies, they were guardians who'd inherited the knowledge of the tower's true purpose from their ancestors. For 150 years, they'd been protecting the secret, ensuring that only someone with the right combination of technical knowledge and moral character could gain access to the mechanism. "They've been waiting for someone like you," Cornelius said. "Someone with the engineering background to understand the mechanics and the courage to accept the responsibility." Through the windows, Seraphina could see the Watchers beginning to move again as 11:47 passed and normal time resumed. But now she understood their patient vigil. They'd been hoping for decades that the right person would eventually buy the tower and prove capable of taking over Cornelius's duties. "The choice. What happens if I refuse?" Seraphina asked. Cornelius's expression grew grave. "The temporal field will continue to deteriorate. Within a year, maybe less, time will begin flowing backward throughout New England. Within a decade, the effect could reach the Atlantic Ocean. The paradoxes created would be catastrophic." He explained that accepting the role meant spending one night each month maintaining the mechanism during the 11:47 temporal window. The rest of the time she could live normally, though she'd need to remain within 50 miles of the tower to maintain the connection. "It's not an easy life," he admitted, "but it's a necessary one, and the tower provides compensations. You'll find that time moves more slowly for you, that you age perhaps 1 year for every 5 that pass. I was 30 when I began this work. By any normal measure, I should have died decades ago." The decision. Seraphina looked out at the town of Thornwick Falls, sleeping peacefully under the Vermont stars, completely unaware that their continued existence depended on ancient clockwork and the dedication of temporal guardians. She thought about the life she'd planned, developing properties, making money, building a conventional success. Then she thought about the alternative, watching time itself unravel, because she'd been too selfish to accept responsibility for something larger than herself. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Cornelius smiled with relief and genuine warmth. "Place your hands on the main pendulum during the next temporal window. The mechanism will recognize you as the new keeper, and I'll finally be able to rest." The transfer the next night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., Seraphina placed her hands on the great pendulum, as instructed. The sensation was indescribable, like touching lightning made of liquid starlight, like feeling the heartbeat of time itself. Knowledge flooded her mind, the precise adjustments needed to maintain temporal stability, the warning signs of field deterioration, the locations of other temporal anchors around the world that she'd need to coordinate with. She understood in an instant the full scope of the responsibility she'd accepted.
Cornelius began to fade as the knowledge transfer completed. "Thank you," he whispered. "The town is safe now. Time is safe." Resolution 6 months later, Seraphina had transformed the adjacent building into a workshop and residence, officially establishing herself as a clockmaker and antique restoration specialist. The people of Thornwick Falls welcomed her with quiet gratitude, finally able to rest easy, knowing their guardian had returned. She discovered that the 45-cent purchase had been orchestrated by the town council, who'd been desperately searching for someone with the right qualifications to take over Cornelius's role. They'd researched her background extensively before allowing her to bid on the property. Once a month, during the temporal window at 11:47, Seraphina performed her duties as keeper of time itself.
The rest of the month, she lived a life that seemed almost magical, restoring antique clocks, learning secrets of temporal mechanics that no university could teach, and slowly discovering that she was part of a worldwide network of temporal guardians who kept reality stable. The 45 cents had bought her more than a clock tower. It had purchased a purpose that transcended ordinary ambition, a responsibility that connected her to the fundamental forces that kept the universe running smoothly. As she often told visitors who admired the restored Meridian Time Tower, some investments pay dividends that can't be measured in money. The greatest rewards come from accepting responsibility for something larger than yourself, even if that something is time itself. The clock face still showed 11:47 to casual observers, but Seraphina knew the truth. Behind that frozen moment lay one of the universe's most vital secrets, protected by an ordinary woman who'd been brave enough to buy a mystery for 45 cents and wise enough to accept the extraordinary responsibility that came with it. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through time and mystery. If you enjoyed this story of courage, responsibility, and the hidden forces that keep our world stable, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing tales of ordinary people who find themselves guardians of extraordinary secrets.